Okay, we still have more to do, so we're going to keep going. I know you might be tired by now, but I tell you what, some of the stuff is incredibly interesting. Let's have a look at Doctrine and Covenants section 10 and how it relates to the Book of Mormon and to Joseph's writings. If we can find some intertextuality here, we can show some dependency, which might be able to let us understand that it's Joseph and the ways that he's working that give this section its base. Doctrine and Covenants section 10 is incredibly long. It is out of place with the other revelations around it in its length. The first 2/3 of this is really about the lost manuscript from 1828. And it mirrors a lot of language from Doctrine and Covenants section 3, which calls Martin Harris a wicked man and suggests that there is some kind of conspiracy going on. But Doctrine and Covenants section 10 goes over this again and again and again and often repeats itself. And the quick basis is that people have taken the pages, they're going to use them to discredit Joseph by publishing them after Joseph has done a rework of the beginning of the Book of Mormon and replaced that text, and that's going to show Joseph in a bad light and destroy the work. But God is wiser than all of those cunning plans of the devil, and he's prepared a way for the replacement text to be different so that there's not going to be any problems. And I've talked about this a lot before, that the idea that Joseph didn't know what happened to the lost manuscript, and so he doesn't know whether it will come back to bite him in the butt if and when he publishes the Book of Mormon and replaces the beginning. And God, in Doctrine and Covenants section 10, does not know either, but God suspects, or Joseph suspects, that somebody is using it to make him look bad. And so this becomes a major understanding around the lost manuscript and its potential problems. And so the 1830 Book of Mormon included a preface from Joseph Smith talking about this issue. And this preface is wholly dependent on Doctrine and Covenants section 10. And I'll show you the side-by-side. The preface is a lot more succinct, but you can see that it borrows wording from Doctrine and Covenants section 10. There are whole repeated understandings in Doctrine section 10 that are left out of the preface. But then you can see that there's whole passages which are included from the Doctrine and Covenants section 10 in the preface. And so this is a good example of how Joseph's writings, particularly as the author of the Book of Mormon and putting it into the preface of the 1830 version of the Book of Mormon, is dependent on what has been already received in 1829 in Doctrine and Covenants section 10. Now, despite having a powerful seer stone, Joseph doesn't know what's happened to these pages, and they never turn up. And so this preface is dropped from subsequent editions of the Book of Mormon because it just doesn't happen. But for us, in these repeated stories examples, it gives us a good comparison that some of the Doctrine and Covenants revelations are then being used for Joseph's writings. And so this gives us a lovely cross comparison. But that is not all. Doctrine and Covenants section 10 is also dependent in that last third on passages from 3rd Nephi. Now, scholars have long really struggled to date this particular Doctrine and Covenants section because there's a lot of different dates thrown out during the years. The original copy is lost, and so we just don't know. But the idea that the preface is dependent on Doctrine and Covenants section 10 and that it includes these passages from 3rd Nephi suggests that it's after May 1829 and but before the Book of Mormon is sent to the publisher in August of 1829. There are also a couple of verses in Doctrine and Covenants section 10, verse 47 and 48, which indicate prayers for Lamanites that they will be returned to the gospel. And this seems to really mirror what happens in Enos chapter 1, verses 11 to 17. So I think that we can use that to date this particular revelation to June of 1829, when Joseph is having to do the replacement text and trying to figure out a way to kind of explain it to the audience why he's doing a replacement text as opposed to just retranslating what has been done before in 1828 with the Book of Lehi. And here you can see that side by side with 3rd Nephi passages ending up in Doctrine and Covenants section 10. And here's some more here. So I think this is an incredibly great example of how Joseph is using passages that from the Book of Mormon that he's already done to inform Doctrine and Covenants section 10, but then also he's writing a whole lot of information about the lost manuscript, which then gets used by his writings in the preface of the Book of Mormon, particularly that 1830 edition. So this gives a good cross-reference between the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants revelations, and Joseph's own writings. So it's a really good example of tying these three things together. And the techniques are the same, so you see that intertextuality between the Book of Mormon, Revelations, and also Revelations and Joseph's writings, which also gives you a cross-reference between the Book of Mormon text and then Joseph's writings. Now, it won't be a surprise to you that there are large passages of Isaiah in 1st and 2nd Nephi in the beginning of the Book of Mormon. Several chapters are copied verbatim from a King James Version Bible through into the text of 2nd Nephi. But if we use the repeated stories that we've already looked at and look at some of this text, particularly in 2nd Nephi chapter 27, which is this whole understanding of a sealed book, which is being used to describe the Book of Mormon and to embellish an understanding of the Book of Mormon coming forth as a fulfillment of prophecy. Here is the text of Isaiah chapter 29, right next to the text of 2nd Nephi 27. And you'll see that they don't start exactly the same way, but then 2nd Nephi chapter 27 borrows heavily from Isaiah chapter 29. But you also see this kind of thing at the beginning, and we'll see some more as we go through, this idea of these parallel understandings that we've identified earlier as another form of composition. And where the text of 2nd Nephi chapter 27 isn't borrowing from Isaiah 29, you can see the same composition. I've highlighted it in that pink and blue, and those similar statements side by side each other that we've seen in other parts of the Book of Mormon. This doesn't happen in the Isaiah passage. But funnily enough, it happens within the text that is being borrowed from Isaiah 29 and being repeated in this new iteration. And I've highlighted in grey, but there's this really specific understanding in 2nd Nephi chapter 27 around the Book of Mormon production and the ways it's going to happen, including the idea that the text is going to be hid up, particularly because there's a sealed portion, and that will be revealed later. Now, this doesn't actually happen. Joseph doesn't rebury the Book of Mormon. He talks later, at least, of the idea that the guardian Moroni came and retrieved the plates and has them to this day. But, this is an earlier iteration of what Joseph kind of expected to happen. And you can see from the ending of these side-by-sides that they match almost perfectly. There are a few gaps on the Nephi side, but the Isaiah portions are produced in its entirety. And this gives really good clues that the author of the Book of Mormon, the author of other passages, is now inserting into these passages of Isaiah and creating them and crafting them in a way that it matches an understanding of the Book of Mormon and gives some ideas about its future. Let's have a look at some more of these Isaiah passages in 2nd Nephi, because there are some problems associated with them. The ways in which Isaiah is being inserted into the replacement text shows some interesting ideas and also some great comparisons with all of these repeated stories that we've been looking at. Firstly, here's a side-by-side with Isaiah chapter 11 and 2nd Nephi chapter 21. And you can see that it's just a complete straight copy from one to the other. And here's the other half. It's just completely the same. Now, this happens for about 10 chapters of Isaiah, which are just completely copied right into 2nd Nephi. Now, there is a lot of research on this, and you can go and have a look, and there are some small wording differences, but basically it's a straight copy. Many of the wording differences are from the italics in the King James Version of the Bible, which have been expanded or changed in the passages of 2nd Nephi. But this shows that there is a massive dependence of the passages in Nephi on the King James Version of Isaiah. We've talked about how Kobe Townsend has a paper on this and shows that those small incremental changes are due to an Adams Clark commentary, that it's being utilized to kind of furnish a slight difference, but just tiny differences in these particular chapters. But what you might not know is that in this case, Isaiah chapter 11 is done again in 2nd Nephi. Here is the side-by-side with 2nd Nephi chapter 30. So this looks like that all of these other passages in the beginning of 2nd Nephi are just a straight copy. Later, Joseph is looking at these and saying, oh, well, actually, I can improve on them and comment on them. And so he reworks Isaiah chapter 11 again. So in this side-by-side, you can see I've taken it right from the beginning of Isaiah chapter 11, and these beginning portions aren't used. And then in 2nd Nephi chapter 30, we see a different text, and we see those same repetitive ideas coming in, and I highlighted them with that pink and the blue. And then as we go down the side-by-side, you can see where the yellow is. These are the direct borrowings from Isaiah chapter 11. And in between them, you see these pink and blue, these other composition scripts that we've seen in other parts of the Book of Mormon. And you can also see the end of Isaiah chapter 11 not being used in 2nd Nephi 30. And where that stops, you see the repeating of these pink and blue, these repetitive statements, suggesting that this composition is going back to the original author. So this is fascinating for a number of reasons. One is that Isaiah chapter 11 is twice in the Book of Mormon, which seems very odd. Why would you even repeat it? But it can be explained when you think about the process that is going on. Maybe Joseph has basically said to somebody, look, copy out these passages of Isaiah. They are going to be in the replacement text. It's a good way of marking up a King James Version of the Bible and then getting a scribe to just, turn out some information, particularly as you need some body to the replacement text. But then later he's thought about it and thought, actually, Isaiah chapter 11 is important to be able to establish some understandings, and I can use that. And so he's now reworking that with some commentary to provide an end or an agenda. So this makes sense if Joseph is doing this. It doesn't make sense if Nephi is doing this, because why would Nephi do it like that? Why would you have two passages the same in the same space of text, especially when, according to the record, it's really hard to write on these metal plates? And why would you then repeat yourself with large passages of exactly the same stuff? And that goes for this particular example with Isaiah chapter 11 being done twice, but also the rest of the books of Isaiah being copied verbatim. Why would you even do that? Why wouldn't you just say to the people, oh, look, Isaiah is really important, particularly these chapters, go and have a look for yourself because you've got the record. So let's look at other reworkings of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. When the prophet Abinadi comes to confront wicked King Noah in the book of Mosiah, we see him quote large passages of Isaiah chapter 53. This is the side-by-side of Isaiah 53 with Mosiah chapter 14, and you can see that they are exactly the same. This particular chapter of Isaiah is used extensively by Protestants in early 19th century America to prove that prophets in the Old Testament knew of Jesus and were prophesying of his coming. And so it's no surprise that this is in the Book of Mormon, and that it's used to try and convince people that Christ is coming and that he's been foretold about by ancient Old Testament prophets. You can see from the side-by-side that it is exactly the same, and the people who have done the later editions of the Book of Mormon have put it in the same verse sequence as it is in Isaiah 53, so you can see the side-by-side really easily. This is not the only instance of Abinadi reworking Old Testament passages into his critique of the King Noah. If you look at Mosiah chapter 12, and here's the side-by-side, the beginning is just straight text of Abinadi talking. In verse 8, there's an allusion to Isaiah, and then there's that same composition pattern that we've seen before of that pink and blue, those repeated phrases being used. And you can see this continuing down till Abinadi uses Isaiah chapter 52 to talk about some things that he wants to say. And the side-by-side show a complete copy. Then there's more text from Abinadi, which has that same repetitive structure with the pink and blue that I've highlighted here. And then Abinadi quotes Exodus chapter 20 verbatim. This is the Ten Commandments. He actually just does the beginning of the Ten Commandments and then does some commentary. And in that commentary, we see that same pink and blue with regard to those repeated phrases. It then switches to Mosiah chapter 13, and we see the next part of the Ten Commandments copied verbatim into the text. And once that's finished, none of the rest of Exodus chapter 20 is used, but the commentary from Abinadi follows that same repetitive phrase composition that we've seen before. And so we're seeing the same types of understandings in Mosiah with Abinadi as we've just seen with Nephi in 1st and 2nd Nephi. Large passages of Isaiah being reworked and reused, and also this idea of commentary where you've got this pink and blue repetitive structure. And so it's incredibly interesting to see the same composition style, the same understanding and working of Old Testament passages in these two different parts of the Book of Mormon, which suggests that it's a common author making these types of arrangements. Many people will be aware that when Jesus comes to the Americas in 3rd Nephi, that the Sermon on the Mount is repeated in the text of the Book of Mormon. But what you might not be quite so aware of is the idea that Jesus also reiterates a number of Old Testament passages right into the book of 3rd Nephi. Here's the side-by-side with 3rd Nephi chapters 20 and 21 alongside Micah and Isaiah. Chapter 20 also displays that same repetitive phrases that we see in other parts of the Book of Mormon. So I've highlighted that in that pink and blue that you can see in the side-by-side. And then you can see from the chapters of Micah 4 that that's being copied into 3rd Nephi chapter 20. And you can see that Acts chapter 3 is also incorporated in 3rd Nephi chapter 20. And in between we have these same repetitive structures that we've seen before. Then we also have large sections of Isaiah chapter 52 that are inserted into 3rd Nephi chapter 20, and these are slightly out of order, but they are exactly the same phrases and passages. And a significant majority of Isaiah chapter 52 is recorded again in 3rd Nephi chapter 20. And right at the end and into 3rd Nephi chapter 21, we see these repeated phraseologies again. And then we see these borrowings from Micah chapter 5, which are also word for word and incredibly prominent. And then at the end of 3rd Nephi chapter 21, we see these repetitive phrases being utilized again. And then we see Isaiah 52 verse 12 being repeated right at the very end. So again, we're seeing the same composition style that we saw in Mosiah and that we also see in 1st and 2nd Nephi. And just like those passages, we also have large chunks of whole chapters included here as well. And this is in 3rd Nephi chapter 24 and 25, which then replicate Malachi 3 and 4. You see, it's basically just the whole chapter copied. And here's Malachi chapter 4 copied in 3rd Nephi chapter 25. This is incredible because this is Jesus coming to the Americas. And he's spending a lot of his time talking about things which are already in the Bible, which are being replicated. But it's interesting that it's in exactly the same style as this is happening with Abinadi back in Mosiah, and will be the same style that happens in the dictation process when Nephi does it with Isaiah and other passages in 1st and 2nd Nephi. This looks like to me the same author and the same composition style being put into the voice of then Abinadi and Jesus and Nephi, all in the same kinds of ways. Now the big question is, do Joseph's writings display this same pattern that we've seen with Abinadi, Jesus, and then Nephi? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. One of the first projects that Joseph involved himself in after the Book of Mormon was a retranslation of the Bible, an inspired version, kind of like a commentary. This began in June of 1830 and went right through to 1833. And one of the cool things that we have is that Joseph, while doing this translation, ended up doing two passages the same. Matthew chapter 26 was done on the 2nd of April 1831 and September the 20th, 1831. So almost 6 months apart. And they're both done from the book of Matthew chapter 26, so you'd expect them to be very close, but they are not exactly the same. Here is the side by side, and you can see where I've put the green passages which are similar but not exactly the same. And while Joseph is using Matthew chapter 26 as a base, what he ends up producing is slightly different. But you can see from the side by side that it's pretty much the same. Large passages that are just completely copied, with some minor variations which I think he thought were quite significant and which would add weight to the Joseph Smith translation as a credible source of inspiration in terms of accuracy regarding the Bible. And we also have some dependency on the Book of Mormon, because in 2nd Nephi chapter 3, there's this whole passage of Lehi giving a blessing and basically talking about Joseph of Egypt, talking about some kind of future seer called Joseph who would do this marvelous work and wonder. And Joseph, when he's doing the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, he includes this information into Genesis chapter 50 and reworks it in a certain important kind of a way. And so here is the side by side, and you can see that passages out of 2nd Nephi chapter 3 are copied verbatim into parts of Genesis chapter 50, and that there's some differences because of the way that he's utilizing the text in a different way. 2nd Nephi chapter 3 is third person, and Genesis chapter 50 is first person. But you can see with the side by side that it is exactly the same, although there are parts that are not included in each side, and they end quite differently. But it's a good indication that Joseph is using the same composition method that we've seen in Abinadi in Mosiah, Jesus in 3rd Nephi, and then Nephi's stuff in 1st and 2nd Nephi. And it may be worth saying that even though Sidney Rigdon is on the scene in 1831 and 32, that this makes no difference to the composition method that Joseph is getting. It is very similar to the Book of Mormon. So in my mind, this is a very good indication that we are seeing Joseph's composition method being used by him in his personal writings that we've seen in the past here in the Book of Mormon and also in the Doctrine and Covenants. One of the things that I think it's important to understand is that the Book of Mormon was Joseph's thing. It was the only thing that he thought he was going to do. There wasn't a grand plan that the Book of Mormon was going to lead to a church. Joseph just wanted to publish something so that he could get some money and save his family, particularly his parents, who were now evicted from the family farm. We know this from Doctrine and Covenants section 5, or at least its earliest iteration. When Martin Harris came back to Harmony, Pennsylvania in March of 1829, he wanted to see the plates, and Joseph told him through this revelation that he was not allowed to see the plates because no one was to see the plates. And part of that revelation also said that that Joseph had a gift to translate the book, and I have commanded him that he shall pretend to no other gift, for I will grant him no other gift. Or in other words, translation of the Book of Mormon, or bringing forth the Book of Mormon, is his only work. That's all he's going to do. And we've just talked about 2 Nephi chapter 3, and this understanding that this is Joseph's only work is reiterated in the text in verse 8. And I will give unto him a commandment, and he shall do none other work, save the work which I shall command him. The original revelation in March of 1829, which was then canonized as the Book of Commandments, section 4, was subsequently changed in the Doctrine and Covenants when it was printed in 1835. Because it was untrue. Joseph went on to do other things, and so the revelation was changed and published differently. It was changed to, you have a gift to translate the plates, and this is the first gift that I bestowed upon you, and I have commanded you that you should pretend to no other gift until my purposes be fulfilled in this. For I will grant unto you no other gift until it is finished. This same change was done by Joseph when he did his translation of the Bible, because he corrected 2 Nephi chapter 3 verse 8, which said, I will give unto him a commandment that he shall do none other work save the work which I shall command him, to be, and he shall do whatsoever work I shall command him. This is an important link to Joseph Smith, because he's changing the revelations that he's got in March of 1829 to reflect the fact that he went on to do more work than just the Book of Mormon. And he's also changing the text of, or utilizing the text of the 2 Nephi chapter 3 differently when he does his translation of the Bible in Genesis chapter 50. Identical change from the same person. Changing of scripture to reflect the reality which actually happened, not the idea that was previously envisioned. Right, I've tried to end this already before, but I think we can generally do it now. There are more to find, but let's just kind of give it a close. Here is the spreadsheet as it is now, with all of those different iterations and repeated stories, and you can see there are just a ton of them, especially when I start to put in all of those cross comparisons with the Bible and also Joseph Smith's writings. We are getting a whole lot of repeated stories that we're able to cross correlate. And one of the cool things you can do is triangulate this, because you have the Book of Mormon passages with repeats within them. You have the Doctrine and Covenants revelations, which with repeats within them, and you have these Joseph Smith writings with repeats within them. And then you can see repeats between the Joseph Smith writings and the Doctrine and Covenants revelations, or the Joseph Smith writings and the Book of Mormon passages, or you can find those correlations between the Doctrine and Covenants sections and the Book of Mormon. And in many instances, the vice versa of those two. This points to one singular source, and that is Joseph. Now here's a couple of repeated stories just to add to the mix. This is Mosiah 12 next to Ether chapter 11, and you can see the side by side. There is a lot of text, particularly on the Ether 11 side, which is not reflected in Mosiah 12, but you can see that they line up right at the very end incredibly well, and with a lot of passages that cross over and are exactly the same. And here's another small one. This is 1 Nephi chapter 9 and 1 Nephi chapter 19. And this is talking about the replacement text and what it's useful for and why it's there and what it's going to do. And you can see in there is a great correlation between the passages in 1 Nephi chapter 9 and 1 Nephi chapter 19. Now these are done both by Nephi, so we should find some commonalities, but the idea that these are being done with exact wording suggests that it is a script which is now being played out and embellished, particularly in the 1 Nephi 19 version, because Joseph has thought of new information that he wants to include in this explanation of why there is a replacement text. And this just means that there may be hundreds of these comparison repeated stories within the Book of Mormon, and many more to find yet in the Doctrine and Covenants, and certainly Joseph Smith's own writings. I'll keep playing with this in the background, and hopefully I'll be able to give you some more information as it develops. I'm presenting on this at Sunstone in Utah on the 1st of August, on Saturday at 10:30 a.m. if you want to come and have a look and see some of these things and discuss these repeated stories and what they might mean.